From what Venus was like billions of years ago to how that could turn into a greenhouse planet, join us as we explore whether Earth could turn into the next Venus. You all know the words global warming, and over the last year or two especially, there has been a lot of pushing to either get active to stop it or to admonish it and say that it's not real. Sadly, global warming is very real, and it's a very real threat to our planet. And if we don't do things to try and save the planet, it's very possible that we might end up like a certain other planet in our solar system, mainly Venus. If you don't know, Venus is a very hot planet. In fact, it's 864 degrees Fahrenheit on average, which if you didn't know is enough to melt lead and cause problems for other materials as well. At present that we know of, there is no life on Venus due to both its atmosphere, which is made up of mostly carbon dioxide, and its temperatures. So you might be wondering, how can we end up like Venus when we clearly have a much different type of planet than it? Well, that's the thing. Scientists believe that once upon a time the planet Venus was a lot like the Earth, until something caused it to change for the worse. How and why are they saying this? Well, Venus has been under study for quite some time due to its extreme temperatures and atmosphere, not to mention it's our twin planet. So scientists have been using simulation technology to try and determine what Venus was like before it was the heat-blasting planet it is now. And they state that between 2 to 3 billion years ago, it may have been very much like Earth, with temperatures that weren't in the hundreds of degrees, and maybe even having its own ocean. Many of the same tools we use to model climate change on Earth can be adapted to study climates on other planets, both past and present, said Michael Way, a researcher at GISS, and the paper's lead author. These results show ancient Venus may have been a very different place than it is today. Now, to be clear, the simulations don't say that Venus was an exact match to Earth, as Venus as a whole has many different things than Earth. For example, its rotation. Earth rotates on its axis every 24 hours. Venus does it in the course of 117 days. Also, the simulation states that ancient Venus was more land-heavy than Earth, and its oceans were relatively shallow. Not that this would have dissuaded potential life on the planet, but rather it would have been slightly different conditions than Earth in its early days. So if this is all true, and if Venus was very much like Earth in the early billions of its lifetime, what happened? Well, this is where conflicting theories come to pass, because for the longest time it was believed that because Venus was closer to the Sun, and thus was more exposed to its sunlight, that it was the cause of Venus turning into what we have now. But according to GISS, that's not exactly what happened. In the GISS model simulation, Venus's slow spin exposes its day side to the Sun for almost 2 months at a time. Co-author and fellow GISS scientist Anthony Del Genio said, "This warms the surface and produces rain that creates a thick layer of clouds, which acts as an umbrella to shield the surface from much of the solar heating. The result is mean climate temperatures that are actually a few degrees cooler than Earth's today. This meant that the sunlight wasn't the main reason that Venus is now a greenhouse effect planet. So what was it? What made Venus the burning hot planet that it is right now? Well, according to many, including the Europlanet Society, they think that a massive global event caused the planet to get much, much hotter. It is possible that the near-global resurfacing event is responsible for its transformation from an Earth-like climate to the hellish hothouse we see today. But what was that event? What could have turned Venus from a habitable planet in every sense of the word to one that honestly just wasn't? Sadly, we don't know the answer, and that horrifies many people because that means we can't exactly prepare for what may happen if we don't know what happened to our neighbor. However, we can generalize the action and/or event itself, because at some point in its lifetime, Venus went from doing a balanced absorption and releasing of heat, not unlike what we have here on Earth, to an imbalance. One where heat was absorbed to a great extent than it was being released. Basically, Venus was in a state of heat stroke. The planet was in a warming state and it couldn't cool down, said Tyler Robinson, an astrobiologist at the University of Washington. Again, how exactly this happened, we don't know, but it is easy to plot how that heat stroke affected the planet and turned it into what we have now. First off, the increased heat would have slowly but surely evaporated the oceans. And while it's true that evaporation is part of the water cycle, there is such a thing as evaporating it too much, because if it's hot enough, it won't stay in the atmosphere, it'll leak out into space, and thus break the cycle, which is what scientists suspect. Furthermore, the increased heat would have allowed more carbon dioxide to fill up the atmosphere, and as we're learning here on Earth right now, the more carbon dioxide in the air, the hotter it gets on the planet. At present, Venus's atmosphere is 90 times thicker than Earth's, and much of that thickness is due to the carbon dioxide, and that's why it's 800 degrees plus Fahrenheit on the surface. Oh, and the atmosphere also has clouds of sulfuric acid, which quite literally makes acid rain, so that's not nice either. And if you think that this kind of rapid change is very unlikely in a planet, you're honestly wrong, because this happened more than likely to another planet next to Earth, Mars. Certain findings and simulations point to Mars also having an ocean or many oceans once upon a time, as well as possibly having greenery on the planet in some form. But unlike Venus, Mars got a thinner atmosphere, one that has a literal hole that appears every 2 years and blasts whatever water is on the planet into space. Add that to the bombardment of space radiation and other factors that an atmosphere usually protects planets from, and you get a cold, barren wasteland that you have now on Mars. So right there you have two planets that underwent massive changes to their climate in likely not too long of a period of time in the cosmic context. Which brings us to, can Earth be like Venus if we're not careful with global warming? Now before we get into this, you might think, why are we talking about Earth turning into Venus and not Mars? Well, that's because Mars had a problem that right now isn't likely on Earth. Not to mention, if the atmosphere were to suddenly get a hole in it, we'd all die, more than likely depending on its size and how long it remained. Right now, the more immediate issue is global warming, which we should be very concerned about. In fact, many people are studying Venus because they realize that where we are right now in terms of studying global warming isn't enough to predict what will happen to Earth in the grand scale. Venus is a laboratory for understanding climate physics and climate change on an Earth-like planet, one scientist said. You can't learn everything you need to know about climate change on Earth by only studying Earth. That's not to say we can't learn anything, and in fact, what we have learned should be more than enough to prove how in danger we are if we're not careful. If you look at the carbon dioxide emissions of our planet in the last several hundred years, you'll notice that a major spike started happening in the late 1800s and early 1900s. What happened around that time? The birth of the internal combustion engine and the beginning of the use of fossil fuels to power machines. These are the things that release carbon dioxide, carbon monoxide, and more into the atmosphere. Now, to be clear, there are natural things in our world that put that into the atmosphere, including ourselves via our breathing. But those levels are very low, and you could even say that they're part of the natural balance of the world, whereas the carbon emissions of vehicles are not. Even if not kept in check, they will heat up the planet, and in fact they already are. The natural temperature of the world has already gone up many degrees over the last 100 years or so, but despite what you might think, it's not uniform. What does that mean? It means that certain areas are getting warmer faster than others, and unfortunately for us, one of those regions is the Arctic, which is why you've likely been hearing about how the polar ice caps have been melting, raising the water levels of the planet. Even the late Stephen Hawking was worried about what would happen if we don't change our ways in regards to global warming. We are close to the tipping point, where global warming becomes irreversible. Trump's actions could push the Earth over the brink to become like Venus, with a temperature of 250 degrees Celsius, and raining sulfuric acid, he said to the BBC once in an interview. And if you recall, Hawking was one of the most brilliant people on the planet. So if he said we're in trouble, we need to take it seriously. But do we have a serious chance of becoming like Venus? It's honestly hard to say, and not for the reasons you're thinking. First and foremost, as we noted earlier, when it was habitable, the planet Venus didn't have as deep of oceans as Earth did, and it had much more land masses. So even if the planet Earth did get hotter by a much larger factor, it would take a very long time to get where all the bodies of water in the world evaporated. It's not impossible, but it is unlikely at the present time. Speaking of the oceans, because of global warming, the oceans are rising, and if global warming continues to melt the ice caps, we'll have even less land to worry about. Earth hasn't experienced CO2 levels this high in hundreds of millions of years, and the resulting sea level change is likely hundreds of feet. So say so long to all your favorite coastal cities, notes one scientist on the matter. So by that token, if the world was to be flooded, we wouldn't turn into Venus, we'd be Waterworld minus Kevin Costner, and thus any fear of becoming Venus would be literally drowned out in the worst way possible. The other problem here is the thickness of our atmosphere. Venus's is 90 times thicker than ours if you recall, and it has a clear imbalance of carbon dioxide. Right now the Earth's atmosphere has about 0.04% carbon dioxide within it, and thus would take hundreds of millions of years more than likely to get to the levels like Venus, and a whole heap of other catastrophes could happen before that point. So is that it? Should we stop worrying about global warming and focus on other things? Not even close. Like we noted, just because global warming isn't turning us into Venus doesn't mean that it's not hurting our planet. The weather patterns of the world are being thrown out of whack. The ice caps are melting and causing the oceans to rise and consume the land. We are in danger. It's just that we're not in danger of being like Venus at the present time. But then again, if you think about what we've learned about Venus, the planet didn't expect to be what it is right now. It was at some point in time very habitable, and then something caused it to burn hot, evaporate the water, and became an inferno of a planet, for lack of a better word. Something caused that, and something could happen on Earth if we're not careful. And for all we know, global warming could intentionally or unintentionally lead to that event happening here. If we're being honest, there is a lot of conflicting information about global warming, and there are just as many people who rally against it as there are people proclaiming it to be real. It can get really confusing, and it makes it hard to decide where to fall on the issue. But here's the truth. We are affecting the planet, and not in the good way. Between tearing down trees, which hurts our oxygen supply and ecosystem balance, pouring out more and more fossil fuels that fills up our atmosphere with negative gas and more, we're changing the world. Some of it is for ourselves, and we need certain things to live, but we also need to be respectful to the planet that we live on right now. It's impossible to know where humanity and the Earth will be in about 100 years. But if we're not careful, we may not be Venus, but the Earth will be a place we may not recognize, and that's more than enough reasons to fight to save the planet, even if it's in your own little way.